Workers' Party Chief Pritam Singh making his debut speech as Singapore's first leader of the opposition today.
That's right. Speaking in Parliament, Mr. Singh set out his party's plans for this term.
Mr. Speaker, my Workers' Party colleagues and I will set our own standards and chart an independent course, just as my predecessor, Mr. Lau Tia Kiang, did, in the face of much resistance, including from many personalities in the opposition camp, as he sought to build a credible Workers' Party. The road ahead will not be easy, but anything worthwhile never is. We will do our best by Singapore and Singaporeans. But how much we can do and how much the political conversation evolves for the better will be driven by three things. One, by the quantity and the quality of information that is shared by the government in Parliament and separately released to the public more generally. Two, by the resources given by the government to analyse and use that information for the benefit of the public. And three, by the willingness of the government to listen to and implement the alternative ideas suggested.
As leader of the opposition, Mr. Singh will sit opposite Prime Minister Lim Yan Liang in Parliament, and he'll have the right to ask the lead question to ministers on policies, bills and motions subject to existing speaking convention and at the discretion of the Speaker of Parliament.
In another maiden speech, new MP and Second Minister for Manpower Tan See Leng said companies will not be allowed to deliberately discriminate against local workers, and the government expects businesses invest more in strengthening the Singaporean core.
Labour MP Patrick Tay urged the Manpower Ministry to consider further raising the minimum pay for employment pass applicants for two sectors, Infocom Technology and Professional Services. Mr. Tay said these sectors generally have more companies on the Fair Consideration Framework watchlist for potentially discriminatory hiring practices.
Also speaking in Parliament today, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat spoke about the ways Singapore can emerge stronger as an economy after the COVID-19 crisis. He stressed that the country needs to stay true to its values as it adapts to the uncertainty and disruption.
It is essential that we rise above our differences and find common ground. Occasional setbacks need not trip us in our perseverance to continue to make progress. Harmony in diversity will always be a work in progress. We may not always agree, but we cannot afford to let our disagreements turn into division. Otherwise, change will cause a rupture in society, as we have seen elsewhere.
For more on the day in Parliament, we're joined by Assistant News Editor at the Straits Times, Lim Yan Liang. Yan Liang, Mr. Pritam Singh delivered his inaugural speech in Parliament as the official leader of the opposition. How was his presentation? Did his delivery live up to the expectations of an LO?
I think that by most accounts, Mr. Singh's speech did live up to Singaporeans' expectations of the leader of the opposition. In a way, it kind of mirrored DPM Heng Swee Keat's speech to the House, in that Mr. Singh laid out the ground rules for the opposition MPs in the House on what is expected of them, and also what he expects in the way that they engage the government and the government MPs. Yeah, and he went about it in a very systematic way by drilling into what he was in broad agreement with the government on, as well as the 5 broad areas in which the WP and PSP MPs would look to propose alternative policies and views on. So I think that by most accounts, it was a very good speech, and it laid out the way that the opposition would go about the next term of Parliament under his leadership.
Delving deeper into the content of his address, Yan Liang, what stood out for you?
So the 5 broad areas that I mentioned are what we can all expect to be the focus, not just for the opposition, but for the government MPs in the next term of Parliament. So the 5 areas are health and ageing, jobs, business and economy, education, inequality and cost of living, and then there's housing and transport, as well as the longer term issue of sustainability of Singapore in its development. So we can see from these 5 areas that Mr. Singh is quite systematic in what he wants the WP MPs and of course the PSP and CMPs to look into, and also the hot button issues that are especially relevant given the COVID-19 pandemic. So earlier I also mentioned that he also agreed that the opposition under him will be a loyal opposition, loyal to Singapore and Singaporeans. So the way he went about that was to lay out the areas that he is in broad agreement with the government on, and also signaling that the opposition under his leadership will not oppose for the sake of opposition. So the areas that he agreed with the government on was Singapore's place in the world. No matter what kind of policy proposals the opposition puts up, it has to be rational. It has to take into place Singapore's standing in the world, its peculiar position in the world, its history as an open trading nation, and that in the areas of defense, foreign policy, and things like multiracialism, he was in broad agreement with the government on. So it's more on the nitty-gritty issues, things like work, the role of foreigners in Singapore's job market. These are the things that he feels that there is room for improvement and in which the opposition can propose alternatives.
Now, also delivering his speech today was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat. He spoke about how Singapore must hold true to its values even as it adapts to change. Yan Liang, what values is Mr. Heng referring to that should be kept? And in the same vein, what sort of changes is he alluding to?
So the values that Singapore should keep, according to Mr. Heng, are the things that have stood Singapore well through its development. For instance, its openness, its welcoming to foreign investment and foreign talent, its multiculturalism, and also that ability to stand united no matter what are the challenges ahead. So while some countries might be turning inward because of the pandemic and the way it is its global impact on the economy, that Singapore should not go down that path. And when he talked about the ways that Singapore should adapt, he mentioned that even as we change our manpower policies, even as we strengthen the fair consideration framework, that the whole point about not turning inward, and also that we should strengthen that tripartism that has stood us well, which is the partnership between the government, businesses, and workers. So another thing that he said that Singapore should redouble efforts to adapt would be the way we develop our people. It's not going to be you learn and then you go into the workforce. It's going to be lifelong learning. We must find new ways to develop everybody throughout their working years, and also to strengthen the ability to find new areas that we can develop and new bright spots that can become industry or sectors of the future that will serve the Singapore economy well.